Hi, this is Dr. A with your anatomy and physiology review over the nervous system. So what are the functions of the nervous system? The nervous system coordinates and controls body functions. It receives sensory input from sensory receptors. It makes decisions about those sensory inputs via the interneurons of the central nervous system. And then it orders body responses using muscle or glands. The organs of the nervous system are the brain, which is located in the central nervous system, the spinal cord, which is located in the central nervous system, and then the nerves, which are part of the peripheral nervous system, which can be further subdivided into the autonomic and somatic nervous systems, and then the autonomic nervous system can be further subdivided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So the nervous system coordinates all body activities. It receives information from both external and internal sensory receptors. So external is things from you outside, so things that you see, smell, touch, hear. And then internal sensory receptors are monitoring things that are going on inside your body, like your blood pressure, your heart rate, etc. And then it uses that information to adjust the activity of the muscles and the glands to match the body's needs. And then, of course, the glands are tied into the endocrine system, and the nervous and endocrine system do work together to regulate the body. So the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and sensory information will come into the central nervous system for processing. The central nervous system will process it, and then motor messages will exit the central nervous system with commands for muscles and glands as a reaction to that sensory information. The peripheral nervous system consists of the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. So they're the nerves that leave and come back right to around the cranium, and then leave and come back through the spinal cord. So the sensory nerves carry the messages to the central nervous system, bringing sensory information to the central nervous system, and then the motor nerves will carry commands away from the central nervous system and towards the muscles or glands. All parts of the nervous system are composed of nervous tissue, and there are two types of nervous cells. We have neurons and neuroglia. So the neurons have three basic parts. They have dendrites, which are highly branched projections that receive nerve impulses, so they gather information, right? The nerve cell body, it contains a nucleus and other organelles of the cell. And then the axon is a projection from the cell body that conducts the impulse towards its destination. So neurons are the cell of the nervous system that is responsible for the nerve impulse transmission. And the axon of one neuron meets a dendrite of the next neuron at the synapse, and there's a gap in the synaptic cleft that exists between the two neurons, so they don't quite touch. Although there are a few neurons that do touch, most of them don't touch, and there's a gap between the two neurons, between the axon and the dendrite. And those electrical impulses cannot directly pass through that synaptic cleft, and so there's a chemical neurotransmitter that's released by the axon, so the signal reaches the end of the axon that causes the chemical to release. The chemical across the synaptic cleft is picked up by the dendrite, and then that causes the impulse to keep going. And so sometimes there can be a competition between the different chemicals, etc. And these are also targets for a lot of drugs, especially drugs that modulate pain. So the neuroglia are the other type of nervous tissue cells, and there is a variety of neuroglia, and they serve different neuron support functions. So they are the crew around the neurons that allow the neuron to function and to thrive, but the neuroglia do not directly transmit any kind of nerve impulse. So some neuroglia will produce the fatty substance myelin, and myelin is insulation for the axon. It allows the axon to conduct impulses faster, and those impulses also won't cross over or jump. So it insulates them also. The same way you would put insulation around wires in a house. The neuroglia, again, do not conduct electrical impulses. They're there as supportive tissue. So here is the structure of a neuron. So we have the dendrites all around the cell body, the nerve cell body, or the nucleus. And then the axon, which is the longest projection that leaves the nerve cell body, and then can even branch, and we have the terminal end fibers of the axon, and these will interface with the dendrites of the next neuron. And then we see myelin here that's wrapped around the axon, and that allows the impulse to travel faster, and it insulates it. Here's a photomicrograph of a typical neuron, and all the little dots you see around are the nuclei of the neuroglia that are around this neuron. So the central nervous system is a combination of the brain and spinal cord. The central nervous system receives impulses, it processes the information, and then responds with an action. It's made up of gray matter and white matter. So the gray matter is unsheathed cell bodies and dendrites, so they are not covered in the myelin sheath, so that's why they're unsheathed. And then the white matter is myelinated nerve fibers, so the nerves are covered in the myelin sheath. Bundles of interconnecting nerve fibers form tracts, so nerve tracts, which are like, think of like roads or pathways, if you will. And there are also 3 meninges that encase and protect the central nervous system. These are membranes, and we're going to look at them in just a minute. So the brain is one of the largest organs of the body. It coordinates most body activities, and each part of the brain is responsible for different body functions. The brain is divided into 4 sections. We have the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the brainstem. So let's look at all of these together. So we have the cerebrum, which is really what you think of when you think of the brain. So you think of the cerebrum. Okay. The middle part here is the diencephalon, which is composed of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And then here is the brainstem right here that just then connects into the spinal cord. And then here is the cerebellum right here. So let's start with the cerebrum. So it is the largest section in the upper portion of the brain, and it processes thought, judgment, memory, problem solving, and language. The outer layer of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex, and it's made of folds of gray matter. So gray matter, remember, they're not myelinated, so everything touches and things connect. Really cool. And elevated portions are called the gyri, and the fissures between the gyri are called the sulci. The cerebrum is divided into right and left cerebral hemispheres, and each hemisphere has 4 lobes. The frontal lobes are interior and control motor function, personality, and speech. The parietal lobes are superior and interpret nerve impulses and language. The occipital lobes are posterior and control vision, and then the temporal lobes are lateral and control hearing and smell. So here they are with colors. So we have frontal lobe here in yellow, we have parietal in pink, we have occipital in purple, and we have temporal here in green. The diencephalon consists of the thalamus and hypothalamus. So the thalamus is made of gray matter, and it relays impulses from the eyes, ears, and skin to the cerebrum so it can interpret it, and it also controls pain perception. The hypothalamus is below the thalamus, which is why it's hypo is below, and it controls temperature, appetite, sleep, sexual desire, and emotion, and it also controls the autonomic nervous system, the cardiovascular system, the digestive system, and the pituitary gland. Next we have the cerebellum. So it is the second largest portion of the brain. It is located beneath the posterior part of the cerebrum, so it's back here, and it aids in coordinating the voluntary body movements and in maintaining balance and equilibrium. It also refines muscular movements that are initiated in the cerebrum. So this is where your athletic skills lie, right? And then next we have the brainstem, it has three components: the midbrain, which is a pathway for impulses between the brain and the spinal cord; the pons, which connects the cerebellum to the rest of the brain; and then the medulla oblongata, which connects the brain to the spinal cord. It controls centers for respiration, heart rate, temperature, and blood pressure, and it is the site where nerve tracks cross from one side of the body to the other side of the body. So just in case you didn't know, the right side of the brain will control the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and this is where the pathways cross. So the ventricles of the brain, there are 4 of them that are interconnected. There is 1 ventricle in each hemisphere, and then 1 in the thalamus and 1 in front of the cerebellum. And these ventricles contain a clear fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And the role of CSF is to provide shock and motion protection to the brain and spinal cord. So if there's fluid around it, and so it protects the brain if there's a blow, if there's, around it in the spinal cord, any kind of like rough movement. The spinal cord is a pathway for the impulses that are traveling to and from the brain. It is a column of nervous tissue that extends from the medulla oblongata to the second lumbar vertebrae. It is within the vertebral column in the spinal cavity. And so the spinal fluid flows down the center of the spinal cord within the central canal, and it is the same spinal fluid that is also around the brain, that is made by the ventricles, and is contained in the ventricles too. The inner portion of the spinal cord is made of cell bodies and dendrites, and it's made of gray matter. And the outer portion of the spinal cord is made of myelinated white matter, or axons. So they're the long axons of the neurons are parts of the spinal cord. And so the ascending tracts will carry sensory information up to the brain, because remember, ascending is going up and your brain is up here. So sensory going up, and then the descending tracts going down from the brain to the muscles and glands that will carry motor commands down from the brain to the peripheral nerve. So, and here are the levels of the spinal cord and the spinal nerve. So we have this green part here is where the cervical area is, and there should be 7, because there's 7 cervical vertebrae. Next, we have the thoracic ones, right? And they're leaving here. And then we have the lumbar nerves. And then at L2 is the end of the spinal cord, but there's still some nerves that are going through here that are, the sacral nerves are yellow, and the coccygeal are light blue right here, with the lumbar ones being in dark blue here. The meninges are 3 layers of connective tissue membranes that surround the brain and spinal cord. So the tissue layers are separated by spaces. So going from outside to in, we have the dura mater, which is means tough mother. It is a tough, fibrous outermost sac, and it's contained, next to it is the bone, right? It's the bone from the skull. Then underneath the dura mater, you have the subdural space. It is between the dura mater and the arachnoid layer. And the arachnoid, which means spider-like layer, is very delicate, and it's attached to the pia mater by filaments. And then underneath the arachnoid layer, you have the subarachnoid space, and it's between the arachnoid layer and the pia mater. And then the pia mater, which means soft mother, is applied directly on the surface of the brain and spinal cord. So here they are illustrated. So we would have skin, fatty tissue, connective tissue, and then we have the bone of the skull. We have the epidural space here. So epi means on top of dura, the dura mater. Then next we have the dura mater, the outermost sac, subdural space right here. And then we have the arachnoid layer, and then which is connected here to the pia mater, and this is the subarachnoid space. As you can see, we have blood supply in the subarachnoid space, and so this is where the blood supply is to bring oxygen to the brain. It actually doesn't run through the brain tissue, it just runs on top of it through the subarachnoid space. And then so sometimes you can have brain bleeds that can cause blood to accumulate in the space. You even can have a subdural bleed. So anyway, that just kind of depends on the damage to the brain. All right, next we have the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, includes the 12 pairs of cranial nerves and the 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The cranial nerves arise from the brain, typically the medulla oblongata, and then the spinal nerves split off the spinal cord with one pair of nerves between each pair of vertebrae. So you have a pair because you have one going right, one going left, right? And the point where a nerve is attached to the central nervous system is called a nerve root. So number one, so these are the cranial nerves. Nerve number one, cranial nerve number one, is the olfactory nerve and is responsible for the sense of smell. 2 is optic, for the sense of sight. 3 is ocular motor. It controls eye muscles and the pupil of the eye, so looking up and down, right, left, and dilation and constriction of the pupils. 4 is trochlear. It controls the superior oblique muscle of the eye, so superior oblique, right? 5 is trigeminal. Controls facial impulses and chewing muscles, right? 6 is abducens, and it controls eyeball muscles that turn the eye side to side movements. 7 is facial. It controls facial muscles for expression, salivation, and taste on the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. 8 is vestibulocochlear. It is responsible for equilibrium and hearing. 9 is glossopharyngeal. It carries sensory information from the pharynx, pharyngeal, and the tongue, the taste on the posterior third of the tongue, and tongue is glosso. So, vagus is number 10, and it supplies abdominal and thoracic organs. It runs all the way up and down the body. Vagus nerve is really interesting. And 11 is accessory. It controls neck and shoulder muscles. And 12 is hypoglossal, and it controls the tongue muscles. So hypo means beneath, glosso means tongue, beneath the tongue. So those are the 12 cranial muscles. And lastly, on the peripheral nervous system, most nerves carry information to and from the central nervous system, but individual neurons carry information in only one direction. So afferent neurons are sensory neurons, because afferent is arriving, so it comes up, right? And so they carry information from a receptor, so receptor for touch or smell or sight or, temperature, something like that, and it gets that information and carries it to the central nervous system. And then an efferent neuron is a motor neuron. It carries information from the central nervous system to the muscles or glands. So if it was something that you touched that was hot and it's too hot, then it may cause impulse to cause you to withdraw your hand or whatever it is you use to touch the hot thing. And then nerve cell bodies of neurons are grouped in knot-like ganglion outside of the central nervous system. So this illustrated what I just talked about. So we touch something hot, the sensory afferent neuron here senses the heat, and it can actually, with an impulse like that, only go to the spinal cord, and then there's a reflex, and the motor or efferent neuron will cause a contraction of the bicep muscle to pull the hand away. So the autonomic nervous system, so this is part of the peripheral nervous system, and so your peripheral nervous system has 2 subdivisions, the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nerves. So the autonomic nervous system controls involuntary or unconscious body functions. So it can affect smooth muscle function in the viscera, so the guts, right, and in the vessels, so your arteries and veins. And it increases and decreases activity of cardiac muscle in the heart. It can influence the activity of the glands, and is further divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. So sympathetic and parasympathetic always have opposing actions. So for example, for the heart, the sympathetic nervous system would increase the heart rate, but the parasympathetic nervous system would decrease the heart rate. It's not always like one is more, the other is less. So for example, one function that's opposite is digestion, for example. So the parasympathetic nervous system turns digestion on, and the sympathetic nervous system turns digestion off. Okay, so that's just kind of illustrating the difference. And these are all autonomic nervous or unconscious body functions. The sympathetic branch tends to control the fight or flight reactions, so activity, right? It's active in times of stress and crisis. It increases heart rate, dilates airways, increases blood pressure, inhibits digestion, so it turns digestion off, like we just talked about, and stimulates the production of adrenaline. And so it's there to help you get something done, to fight if you need to fight, or to save your life if you need to save your life. The parasympathetic branch controls the rest and digest function. So it's a counterbalance to the sympathetic branch. It will cause the heart rate to slow, it lowers the blood pressure, and it stimulates the return of digestion. So obviously we need a balance of both, because we need a sympathetic system to get stuff done, to be active, and we need a parasympathetic system to be able to digest our food and to rest. And so both are equally important. And then lastly, the somatic nerves, they serve the skin and skeletal muscles, and they're mainly involved with conscious and voluntary activities of the body, so like moving your arms around, talking, things like that. The sensory receptors of the dermis use somatic nerves to send information about touch, temperature, pressure, and pain to the brain, but the somatic nerves also carry motor commands to skeletal muscles for you to do all the things that you do during the day. So, all right, so that is your overview of the nervous system. I hope it was helpful.